we're heading back into the Gex series, with the second game in the franchise, Gex 3D Enter the Gecko, which, as the name implies, is the game where the franchise finally made its jump into 3D. Yeah, like many mascot platformers at the time, the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn were where many 2D franchises attempted to make the jump into 3D, with varying degrees of success. But luckily for Gex, he was one of the few who survived his initial release on the 3DO, and Crystal Dynamics decided to take another shot with the series by producing his next game on the PlayStation 1. Not too much to cover here during the development history, but one key thing that was changed was that comedian Dana Gould, as well as being the voice actor for Gex, also wrote the script for the game. However, one massive change from the first game over to Enter the Gecko was the regional localization for the PAL and NTSC versions. Namely that in the European and Australian releases of the game, Gex's voice was performed by Leslie Phillips, while in the American version, Dana Gould reprised his role. Which really does baffle me specifically, as a pure-blooded American. I mean, you'd have to wonder why exactly they would have the localization team do two different English versions, just having a different accent, you know? What the flying fuck was that? That's better. Back to my usual Australian self. Anyway, what this essentially means by having two different localizations essentially giving Gex different voice actors, it basically means that we have two different flavors of Gex here. With Dana Gould's performance, we're essentially getting more of what we loved in the first game, his wisecracks and all of his jokes generally in top form here. As for Leslie Phillips, he goes for a little bit more of a suave James Bond motif to his performance, leading to Gex's lines sounding a little more suave and, to some degree, dare I say, even a little bit sexy.
Darling, sweetie.
Why exactly this change happened in the first place, I honestly couldn't tell you, but regardless of such, one of the big key differences between the PAL and NTSC versions of Gex Enter the Gecko is that with some slight alterations to lines that are generally there to conform to British cultural references.
Welcome to the only thing more evil than the Inland Revenue Headquarters.
One last thing I'd like to mention was a level that'd be exclusive to the Nintendo 64 version of the game, which is based around the Titanic. Now, one thing that I want to make clear now that I mention it is that I am reviewing the PlayStation 1 version of the game, although back during my emulator days from 2010 up until 2015, I've only ever managed to play the Titanic level once, and my final verdict on it is... eh? But before we begin, it's time for another one of Skully's fun facts of the week. According to a UK issue of Retro Gamer magazine, the producer of Crystal Dynamics played the development team a recording of an 8-year-old boy crying over the phone about the game getting delayed, given that he was living in a rural area in Alabama about 50 miles from their nearest game store. A story which, I guess, tugged at the heartstrings of Crystal Dynamics and motivated them to finish the game as per their schedule. A weird little fun fact, but even then I have to give massive kudos and thanks to Callum Sparrow for providing that little bit of info on my Gex 3D Enter the Gecko commentary. Anyway, with all that aside, let's grab our remotes and tune into Gex's plot to see if the game would at least make for a decent television series. Yeah, I'm running out of puns in case you hadn't noticed. So the plot goes like this.
Since retiring from the public eye, I have resigned myself to a life of solitude. For 2 years, I started my day watching supermarkets sweep. Days, then weeks, blurred into one long, sorry afternoon chat show. The next thing I know, some government goons show up at my house. Seems they've caught a whiff of old Mr. Sunshine himself, Raz. He's back in the media dimension, and they think I'm crazy enough to go back in after him. So they whisk me away to Interrogation 101. They play rough. Start giving me the business. I give a little back. So, we negotiate a little something to cover my expenses. They throw in one of those secret agent suits, and I tell them we've got a deal. Looks like I'm heading back into the media dimension. There's going to be deja, ouch, all over again.
And that's pretty much the story. Yeah, like the first game, the plot can pretty much be summed up as kill the bad guy, play through the levels, the end. Stock standard for the time, and one that isn't really intrusive to anybody's video game experience. Although, the strangest thing about Gex 2 is that unlike the first game, it does have cutscenes which you can access by completing 3 specific mission sets by collecting the clapperboards titled The Lost Gex Tapes. But the cutscenes themselves are honestly kind of pointless.
You cut up his brain, you bloody baboon. Chinese secret, huh? Lock and load, little lizard.
Now, don't get it twisted, I wasn't expecting Gex 3D Enter the Gecko's plot to be anything deep by any stretch, but I can't help but wonder if there was a story in the game somewhere that either had to be cut for time or just wasn't coming to fruition at some point during development. And the only reason I bring that up is because of the game's ending. After defeating Rez, he then reveals himself to be Gex's father.
It's true. I didn't always look like this. I fell into a scrap heap while trying to get free cable.
Okay then, Dad. How about we forget all this and go and play footy in the garden?
And that's pretty much it. Okay, time for a bit of backstory, which I think was only ever expanded upon in the novelization of Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko, or I think it might have been in the manual for the first game, I'm not entirely too sure, but here we go. Prior to Gex 1, it was established that Gex's father was killed in an accident at his job while working for NASA, and in order to deal with his depression, Gex turned to the world of television to drown out his sorrows, eventually ending up with a large TV, and thus the events of Gex 1 ensues. Now, while I don't entirely mind the idea of Gex having somewhat of a dark childhood given the death of his father, and the way in which he deals with his melancholy depression, but honestly, at the end of the day, it is something that I see as a fair bit of wasted potential, and honestly, it's something that I really think could have fleshed out Gex's personality, if nothing else. Whoa, that was darker than I thought it was going to be. I'm sad now. So I guess, so we can relieve the tension, get the sadness out of our souls, I think it's about time that we had an ad break, so use this opportunity to, grab some chips, some dip, maybe even a nice, refreshing Pepsi to drink, and join us when we return after the break with more Skully Reviews action.
Introducing the new Mega Cheese Crust Pizza with our revolutionary 5-deck crust. Each layer stuffed with a different type of cheese, mounted on an all-cheese base and topped with ham, cheese, pineapple, cheese, and our famous Italian olives stuffed with an explosive cheese center. Even the cheese has cheese stuffed inside it. Order any family-sized pizza and receive this 2-litre bottle of cheese cola absolutely free. Yeah! That's the all-new Mega Cheese Crust Pizza, also available with double cheese on top. Who said life wasn't meant to be cheesy?
Now, wasn't that a nice, refreshing break? Now, before we continue on to the gameplay segment, this episode of Skully Reviews was brought to you by Mega Cheese Crust Pizza, who said that life wasn't meant to be cheesy. With the shift to the third dimension, Gex's controls have been adapted as such. Returning from Gex 1, Gex still has his jump, his tail bounce, his tail attack, tongue lash, and his ability to swallow flies. However, new to Gex's arsenal is the ability to perform a karate kick by gaining some speed and holding down R2, and then pressing the X button to perform the move. Overall control-wise, I think Gex for the most part has made the transition to 3D pretty well, although there are one or two minor issues that might bother some players who are used to more modernized control schemes. For one thing, the camera, as so many other reviewers of this game have already mentioned by this point, can be troublesome at times, but for me it was mostly something that was more of an every now and again kind of occurrence. So for those of you worried about Gex being plagued with an archaic camera system, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but it is something that I think might show up on the occasion. Other than that, Gex's extended abilities, such as the amount of fly power-ups he has and the ability to climb on walls, has been somewhat diminished compared to the first game. For one thing, Gex can't climb on all walls and surfaces like he could in the first game, which is something I kind of attribute to Crystal Dynamics realizing that it would kind of break all the platforming in the game if Gex could do that, but I'll save my tongue on that one for a little bit later. And as for the fly power-ups, they've been greatly reduced to the fire power-up, which grants Gex enhanced speed, and the ability to summon fire pylons by holding the square button and circling an enemy. The ice power-up functions in a similar fashion, so the difference between the ice and firefly power-ups are pretty much night and day to each other, except that the ice power-up pretty much freezes enemies into a solid ice block. And the last two variants are there to either restore your hit points or give you an extra life. Now, while I can see some Gex fans holding a little bit more of a dubious concern over the fact that Gex's abilities are greatly diminished, especially with the fact that Gex can't climb on all walls and surfaces anymore, for me it doesn't really bother me that much, since in doing so you'd pretty much be breaking the game in a lot of levels. So being restricted to a specific pathway that allows Gex to climb on walls and ceilings is pretty much fine by me. It might sound like Gex's moveset is really complex, but in all honesty, it's actually quite simple to pick up and play, which is a good thing because I feel in doing so, its user-friendliness allows those who have taken an interest in platformers from the late 90s to really start getting into the genre. In terms of mission structure, the game's setup functions in a similar manner to objective-based collectathons, with a mission set in each specific level selected from the media dimension. In each level, you have a list of 3 objectives, which by completing each one, will grant you a red remote, which is your main collectible for beating the game. Missions usually vary between going from A to B in a level, smashing X amount of certain breakable objects, or killing a certain enemy to gain access to a giant television that serves as your exit from the level. In addition to gaining red remotes, the game also contains silver and gold remotes. Silver remotes are unlocked by either finding a hidden silver remote within the level itself, or by collecting 3 tiers of collectibles set at 30 to 40 and 50 collectibles. Each collectibles changing with each tier you collect. Ah, my head. Too many goddamn collectibles. And if you're wondering what silver remotes are used to access, they're used to access a bonus bonanza! These are levels which require you to collect a set amount of collectibles in order to gain a gold remote. What all this contributes to in the end is 3 extra levels in which you can get the secret cutscenes that I mentioned earlier, as well as 100% completion. Now, don't get it twisted. I'm not saying that 100%ing Gex 3D Enter the Gecko is really worth it, or that it isn't worth your time trying to invest into it, and trying to get all the silver and gold remotes and everything like that, but unlike certain other games that I've reviewed on this channel, where the reward you get for doing 100% means jack shit in the end, I don't think it's too egregious if you want to 100% Gex 3D Enter the Gecko, but considering who I am as a person, I personally don't recommend it. But to lessen the monotony of getting remotes and collectibles comes the level variety, which, given the nature of Gex being in the media dimension, this leaves the player open to plenty of level aesthetics to choose from. While many of which are parodies in very broad strokes, we do have our fair share of horror, cartoon, sci-fi, prehistoric, cyberpunk, and of course the returning Resopolis levels to choose from. I'll talk more about the level aesthetics and the technical aspects, but one thing that I will say right off the bat in terms of the game itself, I enjoy the variation that this game has in its levels. Although there are plenty of times during the gameplay where I did find the prehistoric levels and the sci-fi levels in particular to be somewhat of a chore to play. The prehistoric levels mostly because I feel as if the levels themselves don't lend themselves to that decent of a parody material, that and the levels themselves mostly just feel as if they're there to pad out game time, and as for the sci-fi levels, it's mostly because of the fact that there's an air meter in that level which really should not be running as low as it does. As a result of this, the sci-fi levels can mostly be described as having you wait around inside an oxygen capsule, and the levels themselves having very much a start-stop pace as a result. Though that being said, the sci-fi levels do hold themselves to some pretty cool set pieces, like the X-Wing spaceflight, which do make some levels feel a tad more cinematic, which to some degree I feel does give it an edge over the otherwise drab prehistoric levels. Boss fights are nothing really to write home about, but they are memorable for what they are. Of most particular note of that would be the Gexzilla vs Mecharez boss fight and the creepy as all hell Mushu Pork boss fight. I'm serious, dude. What the hell is wrong with this thing? I mean, Rez was already pretty nightmare fuel inducing to begin with, but Mushu Pork? Great Cliff Burton's ghost, man, this is fucking terrifying. However, one thing I will say though, the final boss fight with Rez is fantastic. The build up from the beginning as Rez tries to intimidate you as you ascend his tower, the initial fight as he hunts Gex down via his targeting systems, and of course, this moment. Yeah, that's the real big oh shit moment where you realize that Rez wants you dead. Admittedly though, the boss fight is pretty finicky from this point on in the sense that sometimes Rez pressing down on the buttons to drop giant TVs onto his head doesn't always seem to strike the button's hitbox, but you know what, outside of that, this boss fight is fantastic. Overall, the gameplay of Gex 3D Enter the Gecko does remain pretty solid, even if it does have its moments of weakness here and there. Over to the technical aspects, graphically speaking, the game, while very much drenched in the PS1 squickiness, I feel does do a decent job in portraying its aesthetics. However, the game's use of lighting during the Kung Fu, horror, Resopolis, and especially the Circuit Central levels are fantastic. Speaking of which, Circuit Central. Dude, this is my favourite level trope in the entire game. The dark ambient music, the lighting, the cyberpunk aesthetics, I mean, goddamn, I fucking love this level. There's just something so bloody melancholic about this area of the game, and regardless of whether or not this was intentional on Crystal Dynamics' part, I can't help but fall in love with this area of the game. But anyway, gushing about Circuit Central aside, in terms of music, the game's soundtrack does a fantastic job of suiting the level themes. My personal favourites of which being the aforementioned Circuit Central, but also Resopolis, Kung Fu Theatre, and of course, Rez's final boss theme. but special mention going to the opening title sequence music that plays in the beginning of the game. I mean, dude, there is nothing to me that screams late 90s 3D platformer than Gex 3D Enter the Gecko's opening sequence. Not only that, but there's something that just feels so transcendentally calming about the opening to the game. I don't know, I guess what I feel for Gex 3D Enter the Gecko was kind of similar to how I felt with Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster, but honestly, whatever this feeling is, it honestly feels kinda nice in a 90s sort of way, you know? In fact, is there even a name for this kind of phenomenon? Because if not, then I hereby dub this the Gecko Effect. And yeah, I probably do realise that out there on the internet there might be a different term for it, but fuck it, this is my term. And again, it's something that I think anybody should feel free to use if they ever find that a certain game from the late 90s or 80s, or pretty much any time period outside of the one that you're currently in, ends up recreating the atmosphere of the game, or at the very least the time period in which it was released in, somehow creating a serene atmosphere in which it kind of brings the 90s back. Or any time period, really. Overall, the technical aspects of Gex 3D Enter the Gecko, while archaic, as I had already mentioned earlier previously with the Gecko Effect, managed to create some kind of a late 90s atmosphere which I feel in many ways, it really immerses the player in the kind of television-centric environment that this game was trying to elicit. Even if to some in retrospect this might age the game, but honestly, considering what I mentioned before with the Gecko Effect, I kind of like the 90s vibe this game emanates. And so with all that said, what are my final thoughts on Gex 3D Enter the Gecko? While Gex 3D Enter the Gecko might not be my favourite 3D platformer around, it is one that I'd love to give a playthrough at least once a year. Where I feel the game succeeds is in its aesthetics, its choice of levels, and depending upon which version of the game you have, you either have the wacky comedy fun of Dana Gould or the more suave portrayal of Gex played by Leslie Phillips. In terms of recommendations, if you're looking to dive deeper into the well of 3D platformers, then Gex 3D Enter the Gecko with its variety of level aesthetics to choose from, combined with the wisecracking Gecko himself to keep you entertained, then I'd say you're in for a pretty good time with Gex 3D Enter the Gecko. So on that note, I'm Skully, keep it new metal, and next time on Skully Reviews, it is Christmas time once again, my friends. And of course, since last year I covered the original Metal Gear, it is only fitting that I review Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. And then you'll finally find out why I make these Metal Gear reviews a Christmas review. Keep it new metal, and I'll catch you later. Finally, I don't have to do the fucking American accent anymore. Thank fuck. That was... God, I'm never fucking doing that again.